There is a moment that happens inside an avoidant person that they never see coming. It doesn't happen during the relationship. It doesn't happen during the fight. It doesn't even happen in the days right after they walk away. It happens later, quieter, in a version of their life that looks completely normal from the outside. And in that moment, something breaks open in them that they spent their entire life trying to keep sealed shut. If you have ever loved someone who couldn't let you close, who ran the second things got real, who left you wondering if you were ever anything more than convenient to them, I need you to stay with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to walk you through is the exact moment they realize they need you. And it is not what you think it looks like. Most people imagine this moment as dramatic. A phone call in the middle of the night, a tearful message, a grand gesture where the avoidant person shows up at your door, finally ready to say everything they couldn't say before. That is the movie version. That is not what actually happens inside a real human nervous system that has spent years, sometimes a lifetime, building walls to keep connection at a distance. The real moment is smaller than that. It is quieter, and it is, in its own way, far more devastating for the person experiencing it than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. Let's start by understanding something that almost nobody explains properly. An avoidant person does not walk away from you because they've calculated that you're not worth keeping. That is the story you tell yourself in the aftermath, because it's easier to process than the truth. The truth is that they walked away because staying felt like drowning. Not because of you specifically, but because of what being close to you activated in them. Closeness, real closeness, the kind where someone actually starts to matter, triggers something ancient in an avoidant nervous system. It says, this person now has the power to hurt you. This person can leave. This person can disappoint you the way people have disappointed you before. And rather than sit with that vulnerability, rather than risk it, the avoidant nervous system does what it has always done. It reaches for the exit, not because the connection wasn't real, but because the connection was real enough to be dangerous. So they leave, or they pull back, or they let things fade instead of fighting to keep them. And in the moment they do this, there is almost always a strange, hollow sense of relief. Not happiness, relief. The specific relief of a nervous system that has just successfully avoided a threat. That relief convinces them, at least for a while, that they made the right choice. See, I feel better already. I feel lighter. This proves I didn't need that as much as I thought. This is the story the avoidant brain tells itself in the first days and weeks after distance is created. And for a while, that story holds. But stories like that have an expiration date, and nobody warns the avoidant person about what happens when it runs out. Here is what actually unfolds, step by step, in the mind and body of someone who convinced themselves they didn't need you, right up until the moment they can no longer convince themselves of that at all. The first stage is what I call functioning distraction. This is the period right after the distance begins where the avoidant person throws themselves into anything that fills the space you used to occupy. Work gets more intense. Social plans multiply. Maybe there's a rebound. Someone new who requires no real vulnerability because there's no real history yet, no real stakes. This isn't healing. It's occupying territory. It's keeping every room in their internal house full of noise so that no room stays quiet long enough for a feeling to surface. And from the outside, this can look convincing. It can look like someone who is thriving. It can look like someone who is completely fine without you, maybe even better than fine. This is the part that hurts the most for the person left behind, because you are lying awake, missing someone who appears, at least on the surface, to be living their best life. I want you to understand something important here. Appearing fine and being fine are not the same thing. An avoidant person is often exceptionally skilled at appearing fine, because appearing fine has been a survival skill since long before you ever met them. It doesn't mean the appearance is accurate. It means the performance is well rehearsed. The second stage is quieter, and it starts to happen when the noise stops working as well as it used to. This is usually weeks or months in, though the timeline is different for everyone. The new relationship, if there was one, starts to feel strangely hollow, missing some ingredient they can't quite name. The work high wears thin. The social calendar starts to feel like obligation instead of fulfillment. And in the gaps, in the small, unguarded moments, something starts leaking through. A memory surfaces uninvited. A specific detail, the way you used to say a particular word, a joke that only the two of you understood, the exact quality of quiet that existed between you on a good night. These memories don't arrive with permission. They arrive the way memories always do, sideways, catching the avoidant person off guard while they're doing something completely unrelated, brushing their teeth, driving, standing in a grocery store aisle. And each time it happens, there's a flinch, a small internal wince. Because the memory brings warmth, and warmth to someone who has spent their life treating warmth with suspicion feels dangerously close to longing. And longing is the exact thing they left to avoid feeling in the first place. This is where something important starts to shift, though it is invisible to everyone, including, for a while, the avoidant person themselves. The comparisons begin. Every new person they meet, every new dynamic they try to build, starts getting measured, consciously or not, against what existed with you. Not against the fights, not against the hard parts, against the ease, against the specific way you made them feel like they didn't have to perform. And here's what almost nobody explains about avoidant people. The reason they struggle to let people in is not because they don't value emotional safety. It's because they value it so intensely that they've never trusted it as real. When they experience it, actual safety, actual ease, actual being known, without having to explain themselves constantly, it registers as remarkable. And remarkable things, once experienced, are very hard to unexperience. You can distract from a memory. You cannot erase what a nervous system has already learned is possible. The third stage is the one where denial starts to actively fight back, because by this point, something inside them already knows the truth, and the rest of them is not ready to accept it. This stage often looks like agitation, irritability that doesn't have an obvious source, restlessness that shows up at the worst times, in the middle of an otherwise good day, in the quiet after a great weekend, in bed at 2 in the morning for no clear reason. This is the part where they start doing things that don't make logical sense if you're only looking at the surface. They might reach out to a mutual friend and ask an oddly specific question about how you're doing, then immediately downplay it as idle curiosity. They might find themselves on your social media at hours they can't explain, scrolling, not for any particular reason, just to see, just to check, just to confirm you still exist in the world the way you did when they were the one who got to know you best. They tell themselves this means nothing. They have gotten extremely good at telling themselves things mean nothing. That skill, minimizing, rationalizing, explaining away the significance of their own behavior, is not new. It's the same skill that let them survive whatever taught them closeness wasn't safe to begin with. But skills eventually meet their limits, and this one is starting to buckle under the weight of what it's being asked to hide. Now, here is where we get to the part of this that almost nobody talks about honestly, because it's uncomfortable and because it complicates the narrative people want, which is usually some version of they'll come crawling back and you'll get to feel vindicated. I'm not here to sell you that fantasy because it isn't accurate. And more importantly, it isn't actually what matters. What matters is understanding what's Gen Sure Li happening, because understanding it is what protects you, whether or not it ever leads anywhere. The moment an avoidant person actually realizes they need someone is rarely triggered by nostalgia alone. Nostalgia can be dismissed. Nostalgia can be filed away as sentimentality, as the mind playing tricks, as the past looking better than it actually was, because time softens edges. What actually breaks through an avoidant person's defenses is almost always a moment of genuine crisis or genuine stillness, something big enough or quiet enough that the usual distractions stop working entirely. Sometimes it's a loss, a death in the family, a health scare, something that strips away the noise and leaves them alone with themselves in a way they can't outrun. Sometimes it's the opposite, an unusually still period of life where nothing is demanding their attention, no urgent project, no new distraction, just space. And in that space, the question that's been circling underneath everything finally gets loud enough to be heard. Not who do I want? That question is easy to dodge. The real question that surfaces is harder. It sounds something like this. Why does nothing since then feel like that did? Why do I keep comparing everyone to a version of safety I haven't found again? Why did I let something real slip through my hands? Because I was scared of a feeling instead of scared of the actual loss. That question, once it's fully formed, is very difficult to put back down. This is the moment, not the phone call, not the text, the internal moment before any of that, where an avoidant person, often completely alone, often at an hour when nobody else is watching, finally stops running from the truth that they have been outrunning for weeks or months or sometimes years. And I want to be honest with you about what that moment actually feels like for them, because it is not romantic. It is not a movie scene. It is closer to grief. It is the specific, disorienting grief of realizing you protected yourself from something that was never actually trying to hurt you. It is the grief of understanding that the wall you built to survive an old wound ended up costing you something that had nothing to do with that old wound at all. Avoidant people in this moment are not congratulating themselves on a breakthrough. They are often confronting, for the first time in a long time, how much their fear has cost them, and that reckoning is heavy. It does not feel like clarity arriving gently. It feels like clarity arriving all at once, uninvited, at full weight. Some avoidant people in this moment do reach out. I'm not going to tell you that never happens, because it does. But I want to be honest about how it usually happens, because it rarely matches the fantasy. It is rarely a grand declaration. It is usually small, hesitant, wrapped in enough ambiguity that they can retreat from it if it doesn't land the way they hoped. A message that references something unrelated, but is really just an excuse to open a door. A question about how you've been that carries far more weight than its casual wording suggests. Sometimes it isn't even direct contact at all. Sometimes it's simply visibility. Showing up somewhere they know you might be, liking something after months of silence, small signals that say, I am still here, I am still thinking about this, without ever quite saying the full truth out loud. This is not because they don't feel the full truth. It's because saying it fully requires a kind of vulnerability that still terrifies them, even after everything they've been through internally to arrive at this point. Realizing you need someone and being able to say it plainly to their face are two very different thresholds, and the second one often takes considerably longer than the first. And here is something I think you deserve to hear clearly, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Not every avoidant person reaches this moment. Some never do. Some spend their entire lives running from feeling before it can fully form, distracting, minimizing, moving from one relationship to the next, just long enough to avoid ever sitting still with what any of it actually meant. I am not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the truth more than you deserve a comforting story, and because I think real hope has to be built on what's actually possible, not on a guarantee that doesn't exist. Some avoidant people do the internal work, whether that's through therapy, through a painful enough wake-up call, through sheer exhausted honesty with themselves, and they do arrive at this realization, and they do eventually learn to act on it in healthier ways, and some don't. Some stay in the loop indefinitely, mistaking distraction for peace, mistaking control for safety, right up until the very end of their lives. Understanding this isn't meant to make you cynical. It's meant to protect you from waiting indefinitely for a moment that may or may not ever come, and from building your entire sense of worth around whether or not it does. Now let's talk about what this actually means for you, because I don't want this to just be an interesting explanation of someone else's psychology. I want it to change something about how you carry this. If you are the one who was left, or the one who finally walked away after trying everything you knew how to try, I need you to hear this clearly. The fact that they may one day realize what they had, the fact that they may lie awake one night finally understanding the weight of what they lost, does not obligate you to wait for that moment. It does not mean you owe them a door left open indefinitely. Their timeline for understanding their own feelings is not something you are responsible for managing or waiting out. You are allowed to build a full, real, complete life, regardless of whether or when that realization ever reaches them. Their growth, if it comes, is not a reward you have to be standing perfectly still to receive. Life does not require you to remain frozen in the exact spot they left you in, just in case they eventually turn around. I also want to address something that tends to happen once people learn information like this, because I've seen it happen so many times, and I don't want it to happen to you. Understanding that an avoidant person likely still feels something, likely still carries the weight of what was lost, can very easily turn into a kind of secret waiting game. A hope that if you just hold on a little longer, stay available a little longer, keep the door cracked just enough, the moment will eventually arrive, and it will all make sense, and it will all have been worth it. I want to gently but honestly interrupt that impulse, because waiting for someone else's internal reckoning to arrive on their own schedule is not the same thing as building a life. Hope is not a plan, and your worth was never something that needed their realization to validate it in the first place. You do not need them to eventually understand what they lost in order for what you offered to have been real, valuable, and enough. It already was enough. Their inability to receive it at the time does not diminish what it was. If, on the other hand, you are the one who recognizes yourself in this description, if you are reading this and feeling that uncomfortable tightening in your chest because you know exactly what it feels like to walk away from something real out of fear instead of clarity, I want to speak to you too, because you deserve honesty as much as anyone else here does. If you are in that stage, the restless one, the one where memories keep surfacing uninvited and you keep telling yourself they mean nothing, I want you to consider actually sitting with that instead of running from it one more time. Not to punish yourself. Punishing yourself for having an avoidant attachment style is not the same as healing it, and it usually just reinforces the same shame that built the wall in the first place. I mean, sitting with it out of genuine curiosity, asking yourself honestly what you were actually afraid of. Not what excuse you gave at the time, but what the real fear underneath the excuse was. Because until that fear gets looked at directly, this pattern will very likely repeat itself with the next person too, and the person after that, and you will keep finding yourself in this exact same restless stage, over and over, wondering why closeness always seems to arrive right before you find a reason to leave it. I also want to say this clearly because it matters. Realizing you need someone does not automatically mean you should go back to them. Sometimes that realization comes attached to a relationship that genuinely was healthy and worth returning to, one where the only real obstacle was your own fear, and reaching back out with honesty is exactly the right move. But sometimes that longing gets attached to a relationship that had real, legitimate problems that had nothing to do with your avoidance. And the ache you're feeling is really more about the safety and ease you associate with the memory than about the actual reality of what that relationship was. Not every case of missing someone is a sign you should go back. Sometimes it's simply a sign that you're finally capable of feeling the loss you weren't able to feel at the time, and that feeling deserves to be understood on its own terms before it gets turned into a decision. For those of you who are somewhere in the middle of this, still in a relationship with someone avoidant, watching them cycle through these stages in real time, trying to figure out whether to stay and wait for that moment, or whether staying is costing you more than it's worth, I don't have a universal answer for you, because there isn't one. What I can tell you is this: you are allowed to hold compassion for why they struggle to let you close and still decide, honestly and without guilt, that you need more consistency than they are currently able to give. Compassion and boundaries were never supposed to be opposites. You can understand someone completely and still choose not to keep shrinking yourself, waiting for them to catch up to a version of readiness that may or may not ever arrive on a timeline that works for your one life. I want to come back before we close to that moment I described at the beginning. The quiet one, not the dramatic phone call, not the tearful reunion, but the internal moment where an avoidant person, alone, finally stops running long enough to feel the full weight of what they've been avoiding. I described it as closer to grief than to romance, and I meant that. But I also want you to understand something important about grief, because grief, as painful as it is not the same as nothing. Grief is actually evidence of value. You do not grieve things that never mattered to you. An avoidant person arriving at that quiet, devastating clarity is in its own painful way proof that what existed between you was never as small or as meaningless as their behavior at the time might have made it feel. Their inability to stay does not erase the fact that staying on some level was something they wanted and were too frightened to reach for. But here is the truth I most want you to leave with today, the one underneath everything else we've talked about. Whether or not that moment ever fully arrives for them, whether or not they ever say the words out loud, whether or not they ever come back at all, your healing does not have to wait on any of it. You do not need their eventual understanding in order to move forward with your own life fully and completely. You do not need their late night realization in order to know that what you offered was real and valuable and worth having received properly the first time. Some people wake up to what they had, some people never do. Both outcomes exist in the world, and neither one changes what you deserve, which is a life built around people who are capable of choosing you clearly, consistently, and without needing a crisis to finally understand your worth. If they realize it, that will be their story, one they'll have to carry and reckon with on their own terms, in their own time. But your story does not have to pause and wait for theirs to catch up. You get to keep living, keep growing, keep opening yourself to people who can meet you without needing years of distance and quiet grief to finally understand what was right in front of them. That is not you giving up on understanding avoidance. That is you choosing not to make your own life smaller while you wait for someone else's fear to finish running its course.